Hello, Rams, and welcome to yet another episode of Rams History. Now, today we'll be talking about the final phase of the French Revolution, known as the Directory. Ladies and gentlemen, essentially what we're talking about here takes place during the final 4 years of the French Revolution, roughly the time period from 1795 to 1799. Now, France has yet another constitution, replacing the earlier one written in 1791. This is called the Constitution of the Year 3, based on the new calendar adopted by the National Convention. Now, this constitution essentially will create a republican government. The franchise, or the right to vote, was based on the payment of taxes, and it will establish a new structure for the French government. Now, the structure of the Directory was not unfamiliar to us as Americans. It had an executive, a legislative, and judicial branches. Now, the executive was interesting. It was actually made up of 5 men. The belief here, of course, was that 5 would be resistant to the possibility of any one of them becoming a tyrant. It was felt that 5 were safer than 1. Of course, the flip side of this is now instead of having 1 person trying to make decisions, you now have 5. And this became very difficult. And one of the big problems the Directory would face throughout its history was sort of indecision from the top. It was difficult sometimes to get these 5 people to agree on anything. Now, in terms of that legislative branch, there was a bicameral legislature. There was a lower house known as the Council of 500, made up of men over the age of 30. And then there was an upper house called the Council of Ancients, and this was made up largely of men over the age of 40. So this is the essential structure of the Directory, and again, not too unfamiliar to those of us today in the United States, executive, judicial, and legislative branches. Now, the Directory takes power at the end of the National Convention. It takes over from the National Convention. So Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety are over with. We have the Thermidorian reaction, and then the National Convention writes the new Constitution, and the Directory takes power. And almost immediately, this new government inherits a lot of difficulties. One of them primarily was financial. The French currency in use at the time was known as an assignat, and it was actually based on the wealth of property that had been confiscated from the First and Second Estates. Now, unfortunately, over the course of the Revolution, the various governments in charge basically tried to solve financial problems by simply printing more money. And as we all know, this essentially will lead to inflation. So the Directory now faces a very serious problem with rising prices and a seriously devalued currency. So they do attempt to take some steps. For example, the Directory coins gold and silver, which actually does have real value. They do declare bankruptcy, actually, on 2/3 of the national debt. However, they agree to pay the remaining 1/3. And then finally, the Directory actually adds a whole series of new taxes. For example, if you own property, you were taxed based on the number of fireplaces, chimneys, and windows your property possessed. In addition, the Directory imposed what we would today call sin taxes. For example, things like playing cards and tobacco were taxed. Now, because of these measures, the Directory does eventually achieve a level of economic stability, but for a while there it was very serious and it was touch and go. And actually throughout the history of the Directory, the economy was a matter of serious concern. Now, another matter that the Directory had to deal with was food. As you guys recall, the food supply was actually a major cause for the beginning of the French Revolution. It's kind of like that Snickers commercial, "You're not you when you're hungry." Well, the Directory really kept this in mind, and actually there were some serious shortages of food, at least early in the Directory's history. For example, the Directory actually would purchase bread and meat, and they would then sell it to the people of Paris at reduced prices, effectively what we would call subsidized meals. This, however, caused a lot of resentment in the rest of France, because the rest of France did not get these subsidized meals, although they did pay for them through their taxes. However, the Directory was well aware that Paris was very unstable, and they were also well aware that Paris was full of plenty of potential revolutionaries. So the Directory did make attempts to try to keep the people of Paris placated. Eventually, though, harvests did improve, and to some extent the food crisis began to calm down a little bit. Now, the Directory had its share of political challenges as well. They actually did face a revolt led by this gentleman here, Francois Babeuf, who became known as Gracchus Babeuf. Now, Francois was, I guess, what we could call a utopian socialist. He actually was involved in what became known as the Conspiracy of Equals. Some of his beliefs, I guess, would warm the heart of any Bernie bro today. He believed, for example, that all wealth should be shared equally. He also believed that all Frenchmen should receive the same income. Now, he did not talk about confiscating private property, so in a sense, I don't think he was like the equivalent of a full communist. He didn't want property confiscated, anything like that. He also said that all who were able should be made to work. But what he effectively was proposing, I guess, was in a sense a form of socialism. Now, he also believed, however, that the people of France were not ready to govern themselves. So naturally, he proposed a dictatorship that he would lead until such time as the people of France were capable of self-government, I guess at which point the government would dissolve itself. The Directory found out about this. Babeuf may have been an interesting political thinker, but he was not a very good conspirator. And he and his followers were arrested before this rebellion could really get off the ground. And Babeuf and many of his followers actually wound up on the guillotine. So this particular insurrection was suppressed really before it got off the ground. Now, what the people of France want more than anything, ladies and gentlemen, is they want stability. In the aftermath of the Reign of Terror, people are tired of fear. They're tired of the associated problems of war and hunger. They're really looking for a return to normalcy, as we might say. Unfortunately, the Directory is not really fully able to provide that. It acquires a reputation, for example, for corruption. The Directory would oftentimes try to manipulate elections and things like that, rig elections to try to get outcomes favorable to them. And eventually the Directory, in the eyes of many French citizens, becomes discredited and simply is seen as a government that's really not worthy of respect or admiration. On the military front, however, the Directory did achieve some pretty spectacular things, mainly thanks to a young general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, you might recall that Bonaparte had actually saved the Directory in the very beginning when he dispersed a crowd in Paris with what he called a whiff of grape shot. Well, as a result of that incident, Bonaparte was rewarded with a promotion. He was made general, and he was actually given command of an army, which was then used to invade Italy. Now, Italy at this time was largely under the control of the Austrians. So Napoleon, with his small army, goes into Italy and actually achieves some pretty stunning victories against not only the Austrians, but also against other forces allied with them. During this campaign, Napoleon actually seized a great deal of wealth in gold, silver, and artworks and returned them to France. And he does eventually achieve some very stunning victories against the Austrians, which relieves some of the military pressure on the Directory, and of course elevates Bonaparte to the status of national hero. So after the Italian campaign, Napoleon Bonaparte is a force to be reckoned with in French politics. Now, surprisingly, Bonaparte's next campaign actually takes place in the deserts of Egypt. After he returned from Italy, he briefly considered launching an invasion of England, but he eventually decided that that was militarily impractical. So he decided to do what he considered the next best thing. He invaded Egypt. Now, actually, he had a couple of goals here. India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and Napoleon believed that if he could occupy Egypt, he could cut the English off from the shortest route to India. He also believed that if the French could make a base in Egypt, they could eventually use that as a launching pad to invade India itself. Now, in addition, he had a couple other more practical goals. France was very short on things like cotton and sugar, and Napoleon believed that Egypt could be a very good source of those badly needed products. This was not just a military invasion. He actually brought a group of scholars and scientists with him. During this expedition, of course, the very famous Rosetta Stone was discovered, which eventually allowed us to decipher hieroglyphics. And Napoleon actually also displayed a little bit of his diplomatic side. He made it very clear, for example, that he was not going to war against Islam. Rather, he portrayed himself and his army as liberators who were there to help the Egyptians shake off the rule of the Ottomans. The Egyptians may have been enthusiastic at first, but they were a little bit less so after the French began to tax them. Now, Napoleon's Egyptian campaign will eventually end in failure. The British, under Admiral Nelson, will sink an awful lot of the French fleet and sort of cut Napoleon off. And eventually, Napoleon will actually leave his army behind in Egypt and return to France when he hears of political troubles there. Speaking of those political troubles, when Bonaparte returns to France, he actually finds that the Directory has fallen dramatically in people's favor. What Napoleon essentially does is he gets together with a few other individuals, including Abbé Sieyès, who you may remember as the author of the pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? Napoleon and these individuals, Abbé Sieyès, his brother was involved in this, eventually stage a coup against the Directory. This is called the coup of 18 Brumaire. Napoleon, with the help of his troops, overthrows the Directory. So this is effectively the end of the Directory as a government. Now, in the place of the Directory, yet another government is established, which becomes known as the Consulate. It's intended to be made up of 3 men, including Napoleon. Now, I think the planners really thought that they could use Napoleon as the muscle, that he would sort of provide the force to get this coup underway. And then once the coup was complete, they could sort of push Bonaparte to the side and take power. However, the other members of the consulate really vastly underestimated Napoleon's will and ambition. And after the consulate was established, Bonaparte essentially makes himself what is known as first consul. And as first consul, Napoleon will effectively become, in reality, almost a dictator of France. He will sort of take control, he will push the other consuls to the side, and Napoleon will begin his very dramatic career, which remains one of the most spectacular in the history of Europe. But that, however, ladies and gentlemen, is a story for another time. So I do hope you enjoyed this quick look at the Directory. As always, if you like what you see here, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.